What's the deal with non-linearity? What does it mean to be non-linear? I basically have seen this term get thrown around a lot lately, but it's really hard to see the day-to-day effects and why economists and engineers and people who talk about Moore's law, which we'll talk a little bit about later, just kind of throw this terminology around wantonly. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, when people assume that something is linear, it's because we're simplifying it into a linear concept, and what that means for things like weekdays, for example. So let's read this quote. Start with a linear chain of symbols, A, B, C, D, and then replace the third element with a whole new list, A, B, G, H, D. Indeed, the computer could keep on nesting one list inside of another like this until it had built up matrices, tables, trees, forms, or any other kind of data structures. So this to me is interesting because this syntax that we're seeing here is a language that is referred to as a Lisp language, right? So Lisp languages work in parentheses, so we can read this comic. Lisp is over a half a century year old, and it still has this perfect timeless air about it. I wonder if the cycles will continue forever. A few coders from each new generation rediscovering the Lisp art. These are your father's parentheses, elegant weapons for a more civilized age. So when we see this kind of linear chain of symbols here, and then we can kind of like extrapolate out linear concepts into smaller subsets, we can build really complicated things that indeed might look non-linear to the untrained eye, but are in fact still linear. This list is still a list of linear objects, right? Just because this is a sublist inside of a list doesn't make the whole list not linear. So what does it mean for something to be non-linear? In short, a non-linear function is what you think it is. It's a function that doesn't operate linearly. But like, of course, right? Like what does that mean though? So when we see a function that looks like this, for example, we see that when given different input, it will move in a different and expected. Of course, you can graph this and see how it's going to go. But if you just lived on this line, you wouldn't know what was happening next. You wouldn't be able to figure out that, oh, I should be able to expect that the next day is good as today, right? So for example, let's say that you were a creature that lived on this point in time and your life has been going downhill, right? Let's say that this is your life. So you might correctly assume that the next day is also going to be bad. But then you'd be wrong the day after because now your life is getting better. And then you'd be thinking, oh, well, maybe it'll continue to get better. And you'd be right about that, right? It'll just continue to get better here. Versus if you were the same kind of character on a linear line, you might think, okay, that today is like this. And then you would be proven correct again and say that tomorrow is like this. And then tomorrow is like this. And then tomorrow is like this, right? So every day operates under the same assumption that you had for the prior assumption. And I'm using day as a period of time here that you can track. So again, the terminology of nonlinear gets thrown around a lot, but I find that there's kind of two dimensions for linearity, which are time and space, basically. So let's talk about space. And through space, I'm going to talk about objects and things, inventions in this case, right? So the breaks are determined via statistical tests, but they are presumed to represent general purpose technologies, GPTs, like GPT-3. The 1930s were a turning point in electrification, especially of factories. 1830 was the beginning of the railroads and the second industrial revolution. 1650 seems less clear. It might have been due to the rising labor input that is not accounted for in the calculations or to the rise of the cottage industry. So these technologies had a major impact on the non-linearity of how the society functioned at large, right? Because before there was a way to make cotton, for example, or to electrify a home, you would expect that at 8 p.m. your home is going to get dark unless you stocked up on candles. But then if you were right at this point in human history, you would expect the same thing because every other day that you've had has been like that. But then electrification came out and you're like, oh no, wait, just kidding. I'm here now on the very next day, right? You could see how quickly these things change. And this is where we get the concepts like Moore's law, for example. It says the number of transistors on microchips doubles every 2 years. That's a linear function. We can expect that every 2 years, transistors on microchips will double. And that means that it's a linear function, even though it feels exponential because of the way that humans can kind of perceive how computation is growing. And in a lot of ways, it is exponential. The computer that I'm filming this video on is way more powerful than an Altair 8800, for example. So this computer that we're looking at right here, the Altair 8800, had 256 bytes of RAM in 1974. Today, for example, if we expected that to continue to extrapolate by the number of bytes, then we would say that 2022 is like 50 years later. We should have whatever this number is doubled, right? Every 2 years. And now I have a computer that cost me maybe 3 times as much as the Altair 80B would cost a hobbyist back in the 1970s, and it has 16 gigabytes of RAM. And I didn't even go with the highest version. I could get 32 gigabytes of RAM. And the difference between 256 bytes and 16 gigabytes is massive. So I think that this kind of concept of linearity is really interesting because it's fascinating because it's really good in certain situations and really bad in others. And I will make the argument that I think in general linearity handicaps people because it is a necessary evil for us to understand how to live in this world. So here's a great quote by Ilya Sutskever on Twitter where he says, given that the brain is just a big matrix of vector products, linear algebra deserves more appreciation. So if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that we talk a lot about machine learning. And specifically, we talk about like neural networks and matrix multiplication. We talk about biases and input layers. And basically, Ilya's argument here is that the brain does a similar process to what we see in this input layer, where we have neurons that are firing or not firing, depending on a situation that is stimuli, right? So you can see this much easier in kind of animals like roaches, for example, who are very simple minds that you can kind of take over, or like the kind of Neuralink folks with the pigs and monkeys. But the same process is happening in the human mind. So I think that there's a tendency to simplify things down into linear reasoning because it's easier to look at something like a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and say like, oh, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday at noon are kind of the same thing, but it's not really the same day, right? Like the Earth is in a different place in space than it was the day before, and that might be a linear distance, that might be a a distance that people don't necessarily keep track of. But the idea is that it is different, but we just kind of give it a similar label because it's easier to extract and have a conversation about that. So I think that linear is extracted from non-linearity. As we said before, this works on a space dimension or a time series. A general purpose technology opens up options for creativity like a diverging path. So you can imagine it opening up non-linearity in the space variety of saying like, oh, well, now I have access to 18 different technologies. Funnily enough, this computer, what you're seeing here, is an example of this, right? In the Unix era of the early 1970s, IBM was told that they had a monopoly and couldn't, they had to open source Unix, which allowed for microcomputers to exist, which allowed for the person, I forget his name, who made Altair to make the Altair, which attracted Bill Gates and Paul Allen, which led to Microsoft, which led to personal computing and Apple and everything that we know of today, right? So there was a general purpose technology that was created that opened up the paths of creativity for other people to take advantage of and create stuff of their own. A time nonlinear series is a stepwise function and or compounding. So again, a time nonlinear thing is when you are on the cusp of something, right? So when you are here, that's when you are in a nonlinear point. And a lot of people will narratively put themselves at the cusp of something because it's really interesting to be at the cusp of something and not down here. But we have to remember that a lot of human history, I'm like moving the whole graph and I'm trying to move the dot. So we'll just go with this. A lot of human history was down here, right? And this is actually a very brief moment in time before it just shoots up to basically infinity. I don't necessarily think that a time-wise compounding series is as common as we give it credit for. And if it is, you are 99.9% most likely on this line than you are on this line, right? Because that's just how this graph kind of works. That said, one of the big kind of purposes of this channel is to share ideas and show PKM in action. And there's a reason for my madness here. And here's a quote that I think sums it up really well about how ideas are shared within a either totalitarian government or a government that's more loose with ideas sharing, and you lead to things like open source, for example. So you may not be able to turn your government into a coral reef, but you can create comparable environments on the scale of everyday life, in the workplaces you inhabit, in the way that you consume media, in the way that you augment your memory. The patterns are simple, but followed together, they make for a whole that is wiser than the sum of its parts. Go for a walk, cultivate hunches, write everything down, but keep your folders messy. Embrace serendipity, make generative mistakes, take on multiple hobbies, frequent coffee houses and other liquid networks, follow the links, let others build on your ideas, borrow, recycle, reinvent, build a tangled bank. I think about this a lot, right? Because this is kind of the point, I think, of sharing your ideas. The idea isn't necessarily to be right. The idea is to create create a bigger chance that this number comes quicker and that you can take advantage of the gains of the up here. And I think that when you don't share ideas with people, you're more likely to stay on a line and think that it's a flat line. And but because we can't look into the future, we don't actually know that things can't get worse or can't get better because we don't have any reference point to say like, oh, well, maybe things can get a lot worse or maybe things can get a lot better. We can come up with reference points like we did with Moore's law, for example, but that's taking advantage of, again, a lot of physical properties of, computers making faster computers and people getting better at making computers and things like that. So in the day-to-day life of a career person, there's a quote that's I thought was really good. As a human resources executive told me, I don't expect people to say that it's their dream to work here forever. I roll my eyes at that. No one knows where they'll be in 5 years. Still, the burden is on the applicants to show that working here makes sense beyond the person just wanting a job or the building being 2 blocks from their apartment. Life does not need to be linear, but it does need to make sense. And this is another great example where it's really important, I think, to do things that are risks that you can manage in a way that will put you in an opportunistic situation. So you want to take advantage of nonlinear stuff like the internet, right? So like, again, one of the reasons I like posting on the internet is because it is nonlinear. I don't know what's going to happen when I post stuff on the internet. I don't know if a video will get 1 view or 1,000,000 views. It's really impossible to tell because even if you were in control of the algorithm and put it on the front page, it's the whole lead the horse to water. It doesn't necessarily want to make it drink. And then those views may not even really, translate into kind of like opportunities in the future, but they could, they would never happen if you never even tried, right? So I do think that this kind of idea of needing to make sense is really interesting because it's like you do want to draw up a narrative for yourself. You do want to simplify things into a linear path where you can kind of feel confident that you can change course. But thanks to systems like Obsidian, we can use non-linearity to our advantage and not have to actually worry about being too stressful because we can go into things like graph view, for example, and we can see this non-linearity without being overwhelmed by it. So taking advantage of this too, I think, is a wonderful idea. Using software like Obsidian to get across non-linearity is great. So thank you for watching. I've been Bram. You've been you. Please like and subscribe and have a good day.